Well, the THEMIS project was based on theoretical questions about migration system dynamics. So it's theoretical oriented, despite the fact that you have learned that you have collected a lot of empirical information. So the research questions are: how do migration systems emerge and not emerge? What are the mechanisms by which the migration processes of the past influence those of today? What is the role of the migrant as social actor in the face of these historical and socio-spatial processes? This conference offered very important contributions and fruitful debates to respond to our research questions, and also to identify, which is more important for us, some caveats in our methodological approaches, concepts, and theoretical framework. So now it's time to reflect upon the debates we have had during these 2 days. So we will start by short interventions of the 5 panelists, and we would like them to share with us their views and reflections on the THEMIS project goals, achievements, and limitations, as well as some of the main issues and contributions that have been addressed in this conference by all the participants, mainly in the plenary sessions, but also in what has been discussed in the parallel sessions. In the end, I hope that we still have some time for a discussion, for an open discussion, to exchange some ideas. Well, and without further delay, I give the floor to Professor Joaquín Arango.
Thank you, Lucinda. Let me start by commend and congratulate the IMI team for perfect organization, and the whole THEMIS team for a high caliber, most interesting conference. Let me try to put it in perspective. If we look for its roots, we may seek them in a state of widespread dissatisfaction with the state of migration theories some years ago. Many people felt that migration theories were lagging behind a rapidly changing reality and vigorous empirical research, and that a new impulse was needed. Such an impulse crystallized first in a conference held here at Oxford 4 or 5 years ago at the initiative of Stephen Castles, and has become sustained ever since, especially here at Oxford, at IMI. At this aftermath, Heinde Haas took the initiative, primarily through the publication of a number of papers of a theoretical, epistemological nature, and then in the company of Oliver, Stephen, Robin, through the launching of the THEMIS project. Of the theoretical strands that had been identified at the beginning of the 90s, the most promising ones seem to be those that had to do with networks, social capital, cumulative causation, and systems, migration systems, and the people that I mentioned strive to bundle them together under the umbrella of migration systems. I'm sure we are all eager to see the final results of the THEMIS projects, and to the degree of success of the enterprise. Some fruits are already visible in the form of a greater enhanced attention to internal dynamics and to feedback effects and the like, and it can be safely predicted that this salutary trend will be reinforced in the coming years. But can we realistically expect much more? Can we expect the establishment, the development of a new migration theory, i.e. the conversion of the migration systems approach into a full-fledged theory? I find myself among those, not a few in this room, who have a skeptical view about such a possibility. Indeed, it is no wonder that so far, while we await the results of the THEMIS project, the piece of work that comes closer to the persuasion proposed by the approach is still that of the venerable one of Mabogungye 43 years ago. And it is no wonder that the overwhelming majority of the papers presented in this conference deal with particular, often isolated elements of these migration systems rather than with the systems as such. Indeed, this cannot come as a surprise, as putting the system approach to work is in an exceedingly difficult, almost Herculean task. The emphasis on internal dynamics, which is a distinctive feature of the approach, is to be commended, but of course it has to be made compatible with the attention demanded by exogenous, external, often macro, of a socio-economic, political, and institutional nature, but not only, which can be extremely important, as, for instance, the excellent presentations that we heard this morning have made clear. Put bluntly, it means that almost everything, endogenous and exogenous, has to be taken on board, both at the sending and at the receiving ends. And this, if the focus is put solely on binational or by local corridors and not on more complex systems, such as, for instance, the case of Morocco and similar ones mentioned this morning would require. By the way, the foregoing may help to answer a question that has been floating here in these 3 days. What is a migration system? And I think that the answer comes more easily if you put it in the negative, what it is not, a migration system. And the answer is nothing. Nothing that pertains to migration, that stems or derives from it, or which conditions it can be left aside. Therefore, the systems approach is a holistic one, and while no one will contend that everything has to be taken into account, including the multiple dynamic relationship among its multiple components and elements, no one will deny that the operationalization of such an approach comes close to desideratum. I'm coming to the end. And this is even so without being fully loyal to the spirit of Mabogungye. That is, without including in the picture the other type of flows, financial, commercial, of information, of ideas, that were essential ingredients in his model. Yet, I would say that it is a desideratum worth pursuing, and to the brave women and men who will do so, good luck.
Obviously, Joaquín has said a lot of what I would have said. Let me just reiterate, it was a fantastic conference, and it's also a fantastic project, and it's really great to be here to hear people talking about it. I wanted to engage with a few of the debates that have taken place at this conference. And the first one was indeed on the whole issue of migration systems versus, in brackets, agency or with agency or complemented by agency. And I must admit, in the end, I didn't find it fantastically useful. And I see a little evolution on the conference program. On the back, we have the evolution of European migration systems. And on the front, we have examining migration dynamics. And I think that's the answer, because if you look at the dynamics of real migratory movements, then you do always embrace both agency and structure inevitably. And how on earth can we do research without doing that? So, yeah, I think we shouldn't be talking about theory without constantly linking back to actual research and case studies, and that's indeed what most of the papers at this conference have done. If we talk only about theory, there's a real danger of abstraction and getting lost in the debate about whether we should have general theory or middle range theory or something else. However, and that there is a real danger of rejecting theory in favor of notions of complexity and difference, that we begin not to see the wood for the trees, and we fall into a sort of postmodern fragmentation of everything. And I think the answer to that dilemma is that we should really always see migration as part of processes of change of broader societies. I mean, I've called that in my own work a social transformation approach, that we should look not only at the gradual processes of social change taking place all the time, but at some of the real step changes that change almost all aspects of society, whether it's culture, religion, education, economics, and so on. And if we put, especially the migrations that are taking place around the world today in that context of processes of globalization, neoliberal social transformation, I think we will get a much deeper understanding. But of course, that also puts a lot of pressure on us, because it means we have to be general social scientists as well as migration specialists. So in a way, we shouldn't be talking just about all these contextual factors that affect migration. Really, that's society changing, and migration is part of that in both directions, both as a result and a cause, or as simply as part of it. So what we should be looking at is really the reordering of the economic and social structures on a global scale, and what they mean for the evolution of a global labor market and how that affects migration. And of course, we should also be including in that looking at new forms of communication and at the principles of human rights that fall out of it so often. And I would just also remind you, because we've got the poster of the IMI in front of us, it says that. It says exactly that, looking at migration as part of social change. And I think that is a really correct principle that we should never forget. Then a methodological point, and I must say I've learned a lot from all the methodological discussions at this conference. Global change is always mediated through national and local patterns. And if we want to understand that, we must find ways of doing multi-scalar research and linking those levels and seeing how they interact, but also sometimes have ambiguous relationships with each other. And I'd point there to the work of our friend and colleague Xiang Biao, who's written very interesting publications on this subject. I found that, as I said, the rich methodologies, the diversity of methodologies, the diversity of themes at this conference, very rewarding. And it was very good to see that people are developing new uses, well, or new databases and new ways of analyzing them, which provide very good quantitative data. I would just warn that we shouldn't let the data limit what we research. Where data is not available, or where the quality is low, or where it's uneven, that shouldn't stop us looking at things, but we have to find creative methods. And it's no coincidence that in many countries, most migration research is done on a qualitative basis, simply because big data sets don't exist, but also because we don't, unlike our American friends, have the resources always to do empirical studies ourselves. Used to happen, yeah. Okay. Well, I think hang on, I can't read my writing. Yeah, one final point. I do think we focused a great deal on the transatlantic experience here, and it would be important also to bring in, as happened in some papers, Asian experiences of new industrializing areas, look at the new flows. I mean, this pattern of pessimism about migration in Europe and North America, which is very much a result of the recent crisis, but also the growth in hostility to migrants. You don't necessarily find that in other places, which doesn't mean the other places have better attitudes towards migration. They're often very exploitative, but there are growing flows, new patterns emerging, and it's very important for us to try and understand them. So, congratulations to the THEMIS team, and, well, thank you very much. It was great to be here.
As part of the THEMIS team, I really found this conference very interesting and very engaging, and I think it added a lot to the kind of work that we've been doing over these 4 years and the kind of work that we still have to do after we've collected all these data and have started to think about it. I'll try to highlight what were important aspects that I think were brought about both by the analysis that we've been doing within the THEMIS team and also how these interacted with other presentations that were made here in both plenary sessions and also in the parallel sessions. I was very happy that in these discussions we were able to both count on theoretical advancements but also on very empirically grounded research, because I think this dialogue is fundamental for how we are analyzing migration dynamics. And I think there was a general effort to look at migration as embedded in social transformations, as Stephen has been proposing and others, and also to bring back important social structures within which migration takes place, like power differences, but also class differences. And I thought it's very important that we bring this back into the debate and not limit ourselves to debates based on nationality or origin, based on country of destination or this ethnic group or the other, but I actually start to engage our analysis more with also class differences and class struggles, and I found very interesting also to look at global inequality and what this means in terms of inclusion and exclusion from migration processes, who has access and who hasn't access, and how these changes are responsive to contextual changes, how this is related to different labor market transformations at the global level, at the local level, how this conditions the way migration takes place and the kind of networks behavior in relation to that. this structures migration in different ways, produces different objectives, and also different subjective experiences, and then how this is related to then how networks are willing to continue to feed into migration. These presentations made this morning and this afternoon about the Moroccan case, I think, is very illustrative of how these changes over time take place and how individual subjectivities as well as networks influence this process. Also very interestingly, I thought is a lot based on Douglas Massey's presentation from this morning, how policy frames the conditions under which migration takes place, the mechanism through which it's enabled, but often how the consequences are not of the control of policy, but are related to different roles played by other social actors and at different stages, and also these multiple configurations that we have learned about, and the different patterns of assistance given and received, and how this is framed within our migration analysis. And there's also a lot of doubts in how can we engage with policy making in this, how this work that we've been doing in academia, I think we've been talking about this for some time, but I think it's very important that we still discuss this. How is this gap between academia and policy making perhaps going to be bridged? And how can we combine this with our own theoretical thinking?
Well, wasn't this absolutely perfect conference? I think it's something to do with the mixture of heavy hitters, some of the best scholars in the world in migration are here, seeing old chums, so you can sort of gossip about, and then sort of engaging with younger scholars who you've never met and really don't know their work. So congratulations to the team who organised it. I want to start in a slightly odd starting place. I'll get there quite quickly if you could indulge me for a minute or two. At the end of the 19th century, the most prominent paradigmatic way of understanding the world were really derived from advances in medicine and evolution, particularly evolutionary biology. So it wasn't at all surprising to find that the key social scientists of the time, Turners and Durkheim, used notions that were associated with organic and organisms and talked in terms of body politics and so on. And of course that had important implications for how they understood the world. We could even understand migration a little bit through that analogy. I was struck by Levi-Strauss's remark that faced with people coming in from strange and alien places, receiving societies reacted like a body. They could either ingest them, which we call assimilation, or they could vomit them out, which he called anthropomy. And it gives you a kind of metaphor of understanding something if you say society's like a body. Well, wind the clock on to the 1950s and 1960s, when the dominant and hegemonic thoughts at that time were cybernetics and systems engineering. And not surprising that Mabugunji in 1970 picks up the idea of systems. Now, that's fine, of course, and I'll wind the clock on again and say, as the information and communications technology revolution started going, networks became the dominant paradigm, and Manuel Castells notably introduced the notion of network society. So in each case, what is happening here is social scientists are deriving their language from some exogenous zone of thought. And I had some sympathy with Eva, whose first contribution was say, look, we're talking about a social phenomenon, let's use social words. And I mean, even if we don't go down that road, what I think we need to be aware of
is that when we use this imported vocabulary, it carries some stuff with it which is not necessarily what we want to have as part of our... So is a system really just a bit too mechanistic? Is it a bit too formal? Are the cogs and wheels and feedback loops and boundaries and so on just a bit too much like an engineering model and not enough like a social model, where we may need more ambiguity and more edges and more complexity and so on? So although we derive a huge amount from these, what I would just suggest, just an idea, is that we got a bit too preoccupied in saying migration is a system or migration is a network. And what if we just use it metaphorically? The word metaphor came up a lot this morning, and say, well, supposing we treat migration as if it were a system, it's a migration process, as if it were a system, how does that help us? And it helps us in all sorts of ways, as we've heard in the last 2 or 3 days. What happens if we treat it as a network? Well, it helps us again in all kinds of important ways. We can talk about cumulative causation, the role of families and hometown associations and so on. So what I'm in a sense suggesting is it might just be a way forward for us not to be too obsessed in making the fit perfect, but rather seeing it in a rather looser metaphorical sense, and then saying the processes we are observing are socially derived, and it helps us from time to time to raid other bodies of knowledge to help us understand what we're looking at.
I'll be very quick. I came to the THEMIS project as a social legal scholar, and my interest in the project have mainly been oscillating about how the legal structures, which have been perceived as the macro structures, are actually internalized at the level of individual, in how migrants build a relationship with the legal system in the destination country where they arrive to, and then how these structures are responded to, how they are reproduced, contested, and resisted. And here, I think, theoretically, the project as well as the conference has been really important in stressing how these various social mechanisms operate at various levels. How then these structures influence migration dynamics, visible, for instance, through whether people help others to come, or whether they are more ambiguous or reluctant towards it. Secondly, looking at the conference and the project from the social legal angle, I wanted to say that quite a few sessions brought to the forefront the importance that the migration controls no longer happen only at the border, but quite often actually take place very much beyond the border, be it with the employer sanctions that in the US were passed as the part of the IRCA, or then 10 years later implemented in the UK and now part of the Employer Sanctions Directive at the European level. This all brings me to a slightly negative or pessimistic conclusions about the processes of intensified process of criminalization of migration that are now or for the last 10 years particularly came to focus in the migration and the social legal scholarships, where a lot of immigration offenses are now criminal offenses. The criminal law is being employed in enforcement of immigration law, but at the same time migrants charged with these offenses are not given the same protection and provisions as people charged in criminal proceedings. But in order not to not to conclude at such I don't know, pessimistic or a negative tone. I wanted to, if allowed, take just really half a minute to say that the journey in THEMIS from a personal perspective has been a totally enriching. I think I will be speaking on behalf of a lot of junior research staff that has been employed on the THEMIS project, that it's been a real inspiration and a real privilege to work with the Nestors of migration studies, alongside Robin and Stephen, Hein, Oliver, as well as the other partners in the THEMIS project, Gottfried, Cindy, Jorgen, Lucinda, of course. It's been an amazing journey and totally enriching and totally eye-opening. And yeah, I would recommend to everybody.
Thank you, all of you. Well, we have an Herculean task. The analysis of migration system dynamics should bridge different micro, meso, and macro levels. Migration is embedded within broader processes of social, political, and economic transformation. Perhaps we should use systems and networks as metaphors instead of trying to develop the concepts. Well, we also have learned or listened that we should consider the increasing role of policies in migration processes. The issue of inequalities comes also here. We have also listened that we should consider different dimensions of human agency. Okay, so there is a lot of stuff to think about.